The questions that the lay public were beginning to ask at the beginning of the scrolls is not things like, was Jesus married, or was he a homosexual, or something like that. But first of all, did he exist? Was the leader of the sect, the Essenes, was this so-called teacher of righteousness a prefiguration, as had been suggested by some scholars, one scholar in particular, of Jesus of Nazareth? How much of the Jesus of Nazareth story owed to ideas and mythologies already existent? These were the kind of questions, you see.
The Dead Sea Scrolls suggest that there was a group of people in Israel just before the time of we date Jesus Christ, who represent a church which is a mirror image of the Christian church as we're told it started.
In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy in search of a goat came across jars containing the Dead Sea Scrolls that had lain undisturbed for 2,000 years. Subsequently, more fragments were found that cast more light on a lost sect, the Essenes, that some argue laid the foundations of Christianity. Yet more than 30 years after their discovery, most of the scroll fragments remain unpublished.
If not a cover-up, an unwillingness to tell all at once. There always was a feeling that if we go carefully, we can release the information in a way that need generate no hostility or over-questioning. But we will control it.
John Allegro, one of the team of 8 international specialists who were brought in to decipher the fragments and the scrollery at Jerusalem. Although he trained to become a Methodist minister, he lost his faith and was the only non-Christian in the group with the job of piecing together the fragments.
By that time I was already sceptical of the religious side, and I was interested then in philology, the languages of the scrolls, Hebrew and Aramaic, and interested in textual work. That developed as I came to look at these exciting fragments which had come out of the caves and realized I was the first chap to look at these things and try and read them for 2,000 years, and that grips you. And then you want to get every single meaning you can out of these things and try and put the ideas together and form a synthesis.
The Essenes were a Judaic sect who fled Hellenistic Jerusalem for the undefiled purity of life in the desert beside the Dead Sea. They lived there for nearly 200 years until they were driven out by the Romans during the Jewish revolt in 68 AD. It was at this time that they hid their scrolls in caves at Qumran.
They were the people of the book, the Old Testament. And there were several books of the Old Testament they had on which they had put down commentary, word-for-word commentary. Now, it's that way that you can understand the way they looked at their religion and how it differed from Orthodox Judaism and how it's getting fairly close to some of the way the Christians looked at the Old Testament. And so making a bridge. Then, of course, it becomes extremely interesting because that's what one is looking for all the time. The bridge between this weird Judaism we call Christianity and so-called Orthodox Judaism.
Allegro claims to be the only editor of the scroll fragments to have published his work in full, but he provoked early controversy by publishing one fragment that referred to the crucifixion of an Essene leader, the teacher of righteousness.
In 1956, a new piece had come out of the caves, and I'm putting it together, and I saw the historical implications of it. In fact, it's the only historical piece on the scrolls, within the scrolls actually mentioning historical events. And this is so important that I published it early. And it seemed to me, in the reference in that scroll to crucifixion, that it brought us much closer to the Christian story, the myth of Jesus that had seemed before possible. And then when I published this, there was such an outburst, uproar, not least among my colleagues, who were afraid of the fear that it would upset people, that Jesus wasn't the first prophet to have been crucified or something. No more than that. The links between Jesus and the leader of the Essenes were much closer, or could have been much closer than had been realized. That the uniqueness of the Christian story was at risk. That they then wrote a letter to the Times, and I realized then I'd walked into a minefield, and it's been a minefield.
Because of his suggestion that the fragments hinted at the crucifixion of a Messiah who predated Jesus, Allegro found himself ostracized by his fellow academics who were piecing together the scroll fragments.
The fact that these chaps with whom I'd worked so friendly could suddenly get together and write a round robin to the Times, really in effect denigrating my scholarship or questioning my motives, seemed to me to drive a rift. And sad though it was clear that I was on one side of the barrier and they were on the other. Nevertheless, I went back to Jerusalem many times since, but there was a hostility then in the scrollery, which I certainly wasn't there at the beginning, and I was an outsider.
Weren't you the outsider from the beginning, as the
No.
only one without a Christian belief?
Well, I didn't think I was, frankly. No, I didn't think I was. I was under the impression that we were scholars working together. Merely, and our job was really to publish these things as quickly as possible so that the whole world of scholarship to get working on them too. Our job was merely almost mechanical in merely giving the world what had now been discovered for the first time from these scrolls. I became disillusioned and have ever since. Now it's 30 years and I'm still the only one to have published all this section. So one wonders whether they were motivated in quite the same way.
The scroll fragments found in the cave of the wounded partridge were in thousands of small pieces. They were written in Aramaic, the language of Jesus, Hebrew and Greek. They comprise an enormous jigsaw. As there are several ways of piecing them together, there's the possibility of different interpretations.
There are a lot of gaps, and there's a lot of room for speculative adjustment and so on, and that's as it should be. So the first thing to do is to put the things together as best we can with infrared photographs, and so that scholars can other scholars throughout the world can look at these things, and if they see ways it could be done differently or could be differently interpreted, then they will be able to publish this and question our findings. The most important thing is, you see, until they're published, nobody's seen them. And that remains the situation with 80% of the 400 documents found in that cave.
Edmund Wilson first raised the possibility of a Christian cover-up of the scroll's contents more than 30 years ago.
When Edmund Wilson, way back in the early 50s, publicized the find of the scrolls and suggested that the church was not too happy about these discoveries, he really put the cat among the pigeons. And the lay public, bless their hearts, took this up and said, aha, something's being kept behind, we want to know more about it. And there followed then a whole spate of publications, mostly by the Orthodox, saying, don't worry, Orthodox scholars, don't worry, we know what's in them and there's nothing to upset your faith. And then there was the indications that it was also terribly, terribly complicated and only specialists could understand the scrolls, that the public lost interest. And that's the way I think the church on the whole wanted it. And that's the way they've gone about it, and so the interest has rather vanished. But without that kind of lay interest, the probing, the asking of the right kind of questions about the origins of Christianity, scholars have a wonderful way of just sitting on things, and they've managed to do this for too long now.
Allegro feels if there is no deliberate cover-up by the Christian establishment, then there is at least a go-slow policy that's delaying publication.
As in the case of the copper scroll that we opened here in Manchester. And there specifically I was told to hold off for 6 months. We will let the world know what's in this fabulously interesting scroll. In that case it wasn't religious, it was buried treasure, and we didn't want, the people in Jordan didn't want the Arabs digging up every ruined site they could find looking for the gold and silver. But the same motives there, you see. We will control the dissemination of information. Very, very dangerous, in my opinion.
But who are the people saying this? Are you saying it's the Roman Catholic Church?
All the
Christians
churches,
in general?
all the churches on the whole don't like too much discussion on these problems. They give the impression that they welcome discussion. But when you see the areas in which they welcome discussion, these are really peripheral.
Hugh Burnett is a former BBC television director. 3 years ago, he went with a film crew to Jerusalem. They made a program with Allegro on the links between the Essene scrolls and early Christianity. He now shares Allegro's concern about the 30-year delay in publishing the scroll fragments.
There's no question that the scrolls are not being published. Some of them have been. The scrolls in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem have been published. Allegro has published his. I think some of the other scholars have published theirs, but about 70% still remain to be completed. This is almost certainly due to academic laziness, perhaps, or overworked men, or arguably people who think that somehow it's better not to raise all the troubles that have been swirled up in the past.
Do you think that there is any evidence of a conspiracy by the Christian establishment to stop full publication of the scrolls?
I don't think there's any evidence for a cover-up of a thought-out nature, of a plot, because it's too big a thing to scheme and plot. You couldn't do it. I think, though, that there are certain people who would prefer that these things aren't brought out, and when they are brought out, they're very quick to say, you needn't be afraid. I mean, the Vatican in 1950s said, we need not fear the scrolls. Extraordinary reaction, because you would have thought they'd say, well, thank heaven somebody's found some important documents in the Dead Sea. Let's get them and read them and find out what they mean and what they suggest and how we should interpret them.
The picture we have at present of the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls is only a fraction of that in the hands of the academic team charged with publishing them.
It's a bit like an art historian saying that he's found a famous picture, say the Mona Lisa, and he's printed, or it's been found in pieces, put together, in a corner, but 70% of it still hasn't been seen.
Allegro approached the work on the scrolls as a non-Christian. The rest of the 8-strong team were committed Christians. Burnett feels this is unfortunate.
The work has largely been done by dedicated Christians, and with the best will in the world, they are not going to be anxious to damage their Lord and Saviour, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus of the Gospels. So, for me, it has a double prong, this problem. First of all, one should examine the Essenes, examine their literature, look at the way they were thinking, find out what they were, find out and shout out loud how similar they are to the Christian church as we know it, how they had a rock as a cornerstone of their church, how they believed that their Saviour, their leader, had been cruelly crucified, although that's debated, had been put to death, that his return was awaited, and that here is a natural progression predating the Gospels, showing how the Gospels came into existence, and showing how the story, perhaps, of Jesus and the 4 apostles, who probably never knew Jesus, because Luke, in the beginning of Luke, says that he's collecting together the ancient stories and putting them in order that people can understand them. And then, once you've done that, once the question mark's been raised, people will start, I hope, as I have done, to read the Bible and discover how contradictory it is by its own nature. In one gospel you've got the Holy Family fleeing to Egypt to escape Herod. In another gospel you've got the young Jesus living and growing up and going to the temple, and his mother coming and finding him and being surprised. And having read that, one says immediately, well, why is she surprised? If she's got the Son of God in her hands, why should she be surprised that he's so bright? And if you follow through these clues, I think you come to the fact that in no way can any thoughtful, reasonable person sit and look you in the eye and tell you that the Bible is the Word of God and is unchallengeable, because it's full of contradictions. And the scrolls will help to clarify the contradiction and provide some of the clues as to where the stories came from.
After the break, we'll look at the links between the Essene sect and the early Christians. Christians. The Dead Sea Scrolls reflect these beliefs, according to John Allegro, one of the team called in to piece together the scroll fragments.
The controversial areas, uncertainly, are those which prefigure Christian ideas in Essenism and pave the way for an understanding of Christianity as a developing religion on the outskirts of Judaism. Now, everybody knows that Christianity is a kind of Judaism, a very extreme, almost ridiculous form of Judaism, with the Messiah given a quite non-Jewish slant and so on and so forth. Now, to an historian, religious historian, most important thing is to know where these ideas came from and how they were fused, and at what time, in what particular area of thought and geographical area these things happened. Now, that's where the scrolls can help. They can pave the way. They can throw out clues. A lot of this we shall probably never know. Books have been lost, burned by the church, etc., in the early centuries when they were even more afraid than they are now. A lot of it is bound to be speculative, but the more first-hand information that we can get from the sands, from the caves, untouched like sugar by human hand, that is what we're looking for.
Television director Hugh Burnett argues that the Essene Scrolls are vital to an understanding of the roots of Christianity.
We all believe that Jesus came from Nazareth, and there's an enormous mix-up about why he should be taken down to Bethlehem on a census, which really arguably doesn't exist. There's a clear pointer to that Jesus was, according to the prophets, going to be a Nazarene. Well, that did not mean a person from Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus is simply the Greek word for Joshua anyway. So Joshua is Jesus, and Christ is Redeemer. So in fact, the name Jesus Christ is not a real name, arguably. It's a title, like managing director, or you choose an analogy of your own. But along the road, it appears to have turned into, as did other people in biblical history, possibly the leader of the Essenes was the Jesus Joshua. So that the Jesus Christ, arguably, is a modern, convenient, and deeply rooted. And people listening to this will get irate and furious that anybody should dare say these things. Possibly a convenient relic of a misunderstanding of scriptures and documents which have been rewritten, redacted, and is in fact possibly a play, an act, a drama, which slowly got built up 2,000 years ago, when we don't even understand how people thought. At a time at least 30 or 40 or 50 years after the alleged person is said to have said things.
As a result of his study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Allegro believes that the historical Jesus may have been a leader of the Essene community.
After some 30 years of thinking about this, I felt that the historical Jesus of the first century was entirely mythical, that his real life, substance as it were, was indeed, has been for a long time now suspected, the Essene leader, the teacher of righteousness, who, to my reading, was crucified in about the year 88 BC, and that elements of the story of Jesus, of which there were many elements and many levels of interpretation of these New Testament stories, and that's becoming more and more clear. Some elements, the historical elements, go back to the first century BC, and that the Jesus placed as late as 30 AD made no sense historically.
He's gone even further in publishing a book suggesting that the Christians may have been linked with a cult involving the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms.
The sacred mushroom, the cross, was following the particular mythology of mushrooms, of the narcotic mushroom, of course, the one that has been used for centuries, perhaps thousands of years, as a drug, to instill religious visions and so on. I think early Christianity too was mixed up in that, and that some of the layers of interpretation of the New Testament can be traced to this mushroom cult.
It's more than 3 years since Allegro made the BBC film on the links between early Christianity and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The programme has yet to be screened.
It's been written off as not up to the mark. Well, I've got a videotape recording of it, and I've gone through it fairly critically. And it seemed to me, obviously, it could be much better. It could be much better. It could be put together again in a better way, admittedly. But nevertheless, it raises the questions. It raises the important questions. And I do know that the religious department were never very happy about our making it in the first place, and that they've had more than a say in its subsequent history. So, you know, I'm a little bit suspect that it isn't just the quality of the film that we shot. That we ran into difficulties right from the beginning. We had first of all to find a scholar who would give an alternative view to mine, naturally enough, only quite rightly, but would do it on film with me, and that was difficult to find anybody. Certainly even then, when we did find somebody, he wouldn't actually speak with me on the film, wouldn't confront me on the film. And then when we got to Israel, we found there was a man in charge of the Shrine of the Book, as they call their place where they keep the scrolls, who wouldn't even let us in with a BBC film unit with Allegro. No, he said, every time Allegro touches the scrolls, there's trouble and controversy. It shall not happen here in my Shrine of the Book. And we weren't allowed in for several days, a week or so, and we were going mad waiting for this to happen. And in the end, no less an authority than the mayor of Jerusalem had to bring his weight to bear upon this chap.
Hugh Burnett, the director of the film, is still uncertain why it hasn't yet been screened.
The possibility exists that some laymen in the BBC feel that this is better not talked about. There's some possibility that they've had second thoughts about the way in which that particular film was made, the way in which Allegro put the story over. It's always possible, I think, if something is, if a great deal of work goes into a film or a book, and somebody decides not to publish, it's easy to say, and you can never really tell. The probability is that it is not a plot. I don't personally believe in plots. I don't believe that one uses the word establishment, but I don't think in a real sense there is such a thing as the establishment. But there are people who imagine that they are the establishment. And there are people who imagine that they should in some way perhaps avoid this subject because it might upset people.
A BBC spokesman says the Allegro film will not be shown. This is not because of any religious sensitivity, because it doesn't meet the standards set for documentaries. It didn't come up to scratch, he says. He admitted it was unusual for a large budget programme not to be screened. After the break, we'll go to Jerusalem, where the scrolls are kept, to get the reaction of a former Deputy Prime Minister of Israel and a Dominican monk to the allegations of a Christian cover-up. John Allegro is one of a team of 8 experts called in to put together and publish the Dead Sea Scroll fragments. More than 30 years later, he claims he's the only one to have published them in full. Former Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, General Yigael Yadin, is a world authority on the scrolls. He's also disappointed that so little has been published.
It is a matter of concern. And I would like to mention that the complete scrolls, and we are talking here really mainly on fragments, which are very important, by the way, but the complete scrolls, which are in our possession, we were in our possession of Israel at the beginning, and I helped to acquire them, were all published by now. And the question arose that before the Six-Day War, all these thousands of fragments were in the Rockefeller Museum, and the you like, the Jordanian government actually formed what they called an international team of scholars from all over the world to work in the Rockefeller Museum to publish this group of fragments, and they were supposed to be published in a series by the Clarendon Press of Oxford, the Discoveries in Judean Desert of Jordan. That was the funny part of it. Obviously, they didn't take any Israeli to that. That was quite understood. But they barred out even Jews. No Jewish scholar from the world was taken into the group. Personally, I think at the very beginning, this was part of the reason why there was a delay. These were very distinguished scholars, each in his own field, yet some of them were not really, did not marshal enough the Hebrew language and the Jewish subject they were dealing. However, after the Six-Day War, when we got hold of Rockefeller, there was an outcry in this country among the Jewish scholars. Well, here we are. We have now all the scrolls. Let's take these fragments, thousands of them, and give it to Israeli scholars. But I had a different view, and I persuaded the government and went to the late Père de Vaux, who was the chief editor, who is now succeeded after his death by Père Benoit, and I said to him, legitimately, Israel has the right now to give it to its own scholars. It can't give any right to any Jew or an Israeli. However, I have three conditions. If you would like to comply with them, I'm the government of Israel, and I'm talking on behalf of the government of Israel, will be ready that the work of research will be carried on as it was before. One, that they will be published as quick as possible, as soon as possible. Secondly, obviously, we couldn't stand that it will be the discovery of Judean Desert of Jordan. And eventually they agreed to that. The Judean Desert, that's good enough. I think there was a third condition which I forgot, but these were the main two things. And Père de Vaux promised me that this is exactly what he is doing. I know that he did his best to get all these scholars to finish their manuscripts. I know that Père de Benoit, whom I have a great esteem for him, did their best. I think Israel did it. It was a real gesture. To cut a long story short, I think that the main fault at the moment is in the fact that there are not enough scholars coping and working with the scores of thousands of fragments which are there, and maybe soon the Israeli academic society, if you like, will have to approach the government and say, okay, what we offered, what is it already now, 16 years ago, was a nice offer. I think we respected the academic rights of our colleagues, but so much time has elapsed and so little has been published since. Maybe a revision should take place and more people should be brought into this group, and then, of course, that should accelerate the publication.
Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls involving the Old Testament have been published, and they can be inspected in the shrine of the book in Jerusalem. Magem Baroshi, the keeper of the museum, also wants early publication of the scroll fragments.
There are still thousands, perhaps myriads, of fragments that haven't yet been published, though they have been found about 30 years ago. But it still should be kept in mind that a great deal, I would say the overwhelming majority, if you go by square inches or by letters, has been published. And the complete scrolls have been published long ago. And one complete scroll is worth 10,000 fragments. Certainly the fragments are very important, and it is kind of scandalous that it hasn't been published.
The man responsible for publishing the fragments is Père Benoit, a Dominican monk at the École Biblique in East Jerusalem.
A team of workers were appointed to this work. They were young scholars, not so young now maybe, and they all worked together here in the big room of the Rockefeller Museum. We call it the Scholarly. They put off the thousands and thousands of fragments, tiny fragments on the table, and for months and years they tried to divide them to recognize the different subjects, They say there was maybe 400 manuscripts. It was, it was found in a cave, in cave 4, in Qumran, not in vases, in jars, in the earth. That means eaten by the worms and the, I don't know which insects since 2,000 years. And very difficult fragments, quite different from the big scrolls found at the beginning. I don't say there's no problem to understand their meaning, their content, but it is easy to read and to, that is quite different. You have to make joints and try slowly to get some groups of fragments, and they worked on that several years. It was paid by the fund, but after some time, first the money went out, and they had to go back to their own city and institution and to work as a teacher.
You ran for cash, so the team had to disband.
Yes, they had. We could not support them. They had already a good lot of work made, and they had very good photos made here in infrared light. But they took that with the possibility of coming back to see the originals, and they had to work with other occupations, you see, with their own teaching. And they are to direct a thesis and so on. Much university, much academic work, taking much of their time.
So became distracted from
that. They could not do only that, you see. And also that we had the war of 67, and the Jews, the Israelis took the country. They quite fairly, they respected the right of this team, already appointed since more than 20 years, and they left us to work. But the work continued because the people are still on it. We have already 7 books. The last one appeared maybe 1 year or 2 years ago by French.
How many more to go?
It's difficult to say. Maybe 6 or 8, something like that.
General Yardeen doesn't believe that censorship by the Christian authorities is behind the big delay in publishing the fragments.
I personally do not believe in that at all. Actually, I think it's sheer lack of competent scholars to coping with this it's a vast amount of fragments, jigsaw puzzling, and I don't think there is any other motive behind it.
But do you think if a Christian scholar came across, put together part of those fragments that put a big question mark against the basis of Christianity, do you think that scholar would publish it?
If he is a scholar, he will. Let's put it this way. I mean, obviously, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the main importance to Judaism and Christianity is that they revealed for the first time new data, both about Judaism and about Christianity. And many scholars, either Jews or Christians, didn't like it very much, I must say. But if there are scholars, and I know most of them are, of course, they would publish that, and then they put their view, how, and as it happened in so many cases, and they would explain it away, so to say. I personally do not believe, let's put it to be blunt on that the people who work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I know them personally, and I have different views perhaps of the competence of each, but I know them. I don't believe that any of them, including starting from Bourbon to the top, will just prevent the publication of any fragment because it might harm Christianity. I don't think there is, by the way, anything which harms Christianity.
The keeper of the Shrine of the Book also disputes any conspiracy theory involving a cover-up by the Christian establishment.
There is no suppression of material. I can say it with full conscience. And I don't think anybody in his right mind would believe in a thing like that. There's so many people involved. So many people of so many different denominations. You have Catholic, Protestant, Jews. So if there would have been a thing like that, that would have leaked out. A thing like this cannot happen. I believe, well, it isn't I believe. I mean, the fact is that the scrolls have been allotted to different scholars, and they take their time. They are not in a rush to publish it. This, of course, I believe, unfair, but I would say nothing criminal is in.
You think that the world knows most of the contents of the scrolls already?
Oh, by and large, yes. As a matter of fact, the basic facts about the scrolls have been known already in 1950. Of course, there are all the time additions, our views, our picture of that period, and the Dead Sea sect in particular is all the time being enriched by new publications, but the basic facts are already known for 30 years.
And Père Benoit says that Millet, English scholar now living in France, is just one of the team of 7 scholars who...
It is stupid. I have nothing against the Christian faith. We don't think it is stupid. I have nothing against the Christian faith. And we don't put this in our drawers to, no, I wrote some pages to say, maybe on the discoveries. I wrote some pages to say, maybe I intend to write again. The steam is working. Milik is that the steam is working. September. Milik is working. I saw him last September in Paris. I told him 2 years ago, please do only that because he had other projects of publication. He told me, I work only on that. I hope to have one manuscript. I am free to give you a deadline, but I feel that maybe 1-2 years you will have a manuscript.
After the break, we hear more from John Allegro, who says there is a cover-up.
Hello, John Mason here.
Purchased 2 that Christianity has very close links with the Essene beliefs. Boroshi of the Shrine of the Book, where one of the scrolls is kept, disputes this view.
The consensus among scholars today is that the Dead Sea sect, or we believe now that they were the Essenes, this is the real name of the movement, had very little in common with St. John the Baptist, as preserved in the scriptures, and mostly with Jesus. Jesus has even a reference to the sectarians, to the children of light, as he refers to them. And from this, one can see that he doesn't think of them very much. Pious, but a bunch of fools.
Benoit admits the Essene beliefs may have played a part in early Christianity.
There are very interesting connections, of course. The main interest of this discovery is first to give us a new aspect of the biblical text. Rather faithful. We see our tradition rather faithful, but many yes, variant readings, interesting, and to give us also a new face of Judaism. We knew mainly Judaism by the Talmud. It is one branch of the Judaism, the school of Hillel, mainly. And now, in this sect, we have quite another kind of Judaism, more nearer to the time of Jesus, of the Christianity, and that gives many parallels of expressions, of language, of thought. Myself, I don't think at all that Jesus was in a scene and he changed. No, he must have known them. In the Gospel, we have very, very little allusion, possible allusions, Of course, there are some parallels. The voice preaching in the desert and so on. He lived in the neighborhood of this. It is true. He must have known them. But he was not himself a Messiah, I don't think so. And for me, in my mind, the influence of the Saint Essenes came later, in time of Paul and John, you see. In the first letter of John, in the Gospel, maybe in the first letter, you see a kind of a mode of thought, the light and the darkness and so on, that we understand much better through these new discoveries.
Some scholars believe that the Essenes survived the Roman crackdown during the Jewish revolt in 68 AD. Boroshi of the Shrine of the Book.
I, for one, and I believe I'm in a minority, though I believe I can substantiate it, hold that the Essenes carried out some kind of underground existence for many centuries to come. But as of the Middle Ages, they must have disappeared forever. They carried out this underground in view of suppression, persecutions, and things like that. But after the year 1000, I don't believe anyone of their camp followers was still alive.
And that Piccadilly investigation into the Dead Sea Scrolls.
The questions that the lay public were beginning to ask at the beginning of the scrolls is not things like, was Jesus married or was he a homosexual or something like that. But first of all, did he exist? Was the leader of the sect, the Essenes, was this so-called teacher of righteousness a prefiguration, as had been suggested by some scholars, one scholar in particular, of Jesus of Nazareth? How much of the Jesus of Nazareth story owed to ideas and mythologies already existent? These were the kind of questions, you see.
The Dead Sea Scrolls suggest that there was a group of people in Israel just before the time of we date Jesus Christ, who represent a church which is a mirror image of the Christian church as we're told it started.
In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy in search of a goat came across jars containing the Dead Sea Scrolls that had lain undisturbed for 2,000 years. Subsequently, more fragments were found that cast more light on a lost sect, the Essenes, that some argue laid the foundations of Christianity. Yet more than 30 years after their discovery, most of the scroll fragments remain unpublished.
If not a cover-up, an unwillingness to tell all at once. There always was a feeling that if we go carefully, we can release the information in a way that need generate no hostility or over-questioning. But we will control it.
John Allegro, one of the team of 8 international specialists who were brought in to decipher the fragment in caves at Qumran.
They were the people of the book, the Old Testament. And there were several books of the Old Testament they had on which they had put down commentary, word-for-word commentary. Now, it's that way that you can understand the way they looked at their religion and how it differed from Orthodox Judaism and how it's getting fairly close to some of the way the Christians looked at the Old Testament. And so making a bridge. Then, of course, it becomes extremely interesting because that's what one is looking for all the time. The bridge between this weird Judaism we call Christianity and so-called Orthodox Judaism.
Allegro claims to be the only editor of the scroll fragments to have published his work in full, but he provoked early controversy by publishing one fragment that referred to the crucifixion of an Essene leader, the teacher of righteousness.
In 1956, a new piece had come out of the caves, and I'm putting it together and I saw the historical
and the scrollery at Jerusalem. Although he trained to become a Methodist minister, he lost his faith and was the only non-Christian in the group with the job of piecing together the fragments.
By that time I was very sceptical of well, the religious side, and I was interested then in philology, the languages of the scrolls, Hebrew and Aramaic, and interested in textual work. That developed as I came to look at these exciting fragments which had come out of the caves and realized I was the first chap to look at these things and try and read them for 2,000 years, and that grips you. And then you want to get every single meaning you can out of these things and try and put the ideas together and form a synthesis.
The Essenes were a Judaic sect who fled Hellenistic Jerusalem for the undefiled purity of life in the desert beside the Dead Sea. They lived there for nearly 200 years until they were driven out by the Romans during the Jewish revolt in 68 AD. It was at this time that they hid their scrolls.
Implications of it, in fact, is the only historical piece on the scrolls, within the scrolls actually mentioning historical events. And this is so important that I published it early. And it seemed to me, in the reference in that scroll to crucifixion, that it brought us much closer to the Christian story, the myth of Jesus that had seemed before possible. And then when I published this, there was such an outburst, uproar, not least among my colleagues, who were afraid of the fear that it would upset people, that Jesus wasn't the first prophet to have been crucified or something. No more than that. The links between Jesus and the leader of the Essenes were much closer, or could have been much closer than had been realized. That the uniqueness of the Christian story was at risk. That they then wrote a letter to the Times, and I realized then I'd walked into a minefield.